There were, he said, two principal causes which tended materially to assist the restoration of literature and the arts in England and in other countries of Europe. These were the Crusades and the extension or the establishment of the Freemasons' institution in the north and west of Europe. The adventurers who returned from the Holy Land brought back some ideas of various improvements, particularly in architecture, and along with these a strong desire to erect castellated ecclesiastical and palatial edifices to display the taste that they had acquired, and in less than a century from the First Crusade, above 600 buildings of the above description had been erected in southern and western Europe. This taste, he thinks, was spread into almost all countries by the establishment of the fraternity of Freemasons, who, it appears, had, under some peculiar form of brotherhood, existed for an immemorial period in Syria and other parts of the East, whence some bands of them migrated to Europe, and, after a time, a great efflux of these men, Italian, German, French, Spanish, etc., had spread themselves in communities through all civilized Europe, and in all countries where they settled we find the same style of architecture from that period, but differing in some points of treatment as suited the climate. The latter part of this statement requires confirmation. I do not think that there is any historical evidence of the ingress into Europe of bands of the Syrian secret fraternities during or after the Crusades, nor is there any probability that such an ingress could have occurred. But the historical testimonies are very strong that the literature and arts of Europe, and especially its architecture, were materially advanced by the influence of the returning Crusaders, whose own knowledge had been enlarged and their taste cultivated by their contact with the nations of the East. This topic appertains, however, to the historical rather than to the legendary study of Masonry, and will at a future time in the course of this work command our attention. At present, we must restrict ourselves to the consideration of the theory that traditionally connects the Crusaders and especially the Knights Templars with the establishment of the Masonic institution through their intercourse with the secret societies of Syria. The inventor of the theory that Freemasonry was instituted in the Holy Land by the Crusaders and by them on their return introduced into Europe was the Chevalier Michael Ramsay, to whom Masonry is indebted, whatever may be the value of the debt, for the system of high degrees and the manufacture of rights. In the year 1740, Ramsay was the Grand Orator and delivered a discourse before the Grand Lodge of France, in which he thus traces the origin of Freemasonry. Rejecting as fabulous all hypotheses which trace the foundation of the order to the patriarchs, to Enoch, Noah, or Solomon, he finds its origin in the time of the Crusades. In the time, he says, of the holy wars in Palestine, many princes, nobles, and citizens associated themselves together and entered into vows to re-establish Christian temples in the Holy Land, and engaged themselves by an oath to employ their talents and their fortunes in restoring architecture to its primitive condition. They adopted signs and symbolic words derived from religion, by which they might distinguish themselves from the infidels and recognize each other in the midst of the Saracens. They communicated these words only to those who had previously sworn a solemn oath, often taken at the altar, that they would not reveal them. Some time after, this order was united with that of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, for which reason in all countries our lodges are called Lodges of St. John. This union of the two orders was made in imitation of the conduct of the Israelites at the building of the Second Temple, when they held the trowel in one hand and the sword in the other. Our order must not, therefore, be regarded as a renewal of the Bacchanalian orgies and as a source of senseless dissipation, of unbridled libertinism, and of scandalous intemperance, but as a moral order instituted by our ancestors in the Holy Land to recall the recollection of the most sublime truths in the midst of the innocent pleasures of society. The kings, princes, and nobles, when they returned from Palestine into their native dominions, established lodges. At the time of the last crusade, several lodges had already been erected in Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and from the last in Scotland, in consequence of the intimate relations which existed between those two countries. James, Lord Steward of Scotland, was the Grand Master of a lodge established at Kilwinning, in the west of Scotland, in the year 1236, a short time after the death of Alexander III, King of Scotland, and a year before John Balliol ascended the throne. This Scottish lord received the Earls of Gloucester and Ulster, English and Irish noblemen, as masons into his lodge. By degrees, our lodges, our festivals, and solemnities were neglected in most of the countries in which they had been established. Hence the silence of the historians of all nations except Great Britain on the subject of our order. It was preserved, however, in all its splendor by the Scotch, to whom for several centuries the kings of France had entrusted the guardianship of their person. Footnote. Ramsay here refers to the company of musketeers, composed entirely of Scotchmen of noble birth, which constituted the bodyguard of the kings of France. The reader of the Waverley novels will remember that the renowned Balafré, in the story of Quentin Durward, was a member of this company. After the lamentable reverses of the Crusades, the destruction of the Christian armies, and the triumph of Bendokdar, the Sultan of Egypt, in 1263, during the 8th and 9th Crusades, the great Prince Edward, son of Henry III, King of England, seeing that there would be no security for the brethren in the Holy Land when the Christians should have retired, led them away, and thus a colony of the fraternity was established in England. As this prince was endowed with all the qualities of mind and heart which constitute the hero, he loved the fine arts and declared himself the protector of our order. He granted it several privileges and franchises, and ever since the members of the confraternity have assumed the name of Freemasons. From this time Great Britain became the seat of our sciences, the conservatrix of our laws, and the depository of our secrets. The religious dissensions which so fatally pervaded and rent all Europe during the 16th century caused our order to degenerate from the grandeur and nobility of its origin. Several of our rites and usages which were opposed to the prejudices of the times were changed, disguised, or retrenched. Thus it is that several of our brethren have, like the ancient Jews, forgotten the spirit of our laws, and preserved only the letter and the outer covering. But from the British Islands, the ancient science is now beginning to pass into France. Such was the theory of Ramsay, principal points of which he had already incorporated into the rite of 6 degrees which bears his name. This rite might be called the mother of all the rites which followed it, and which in a few years covered the continent with a web of high degrees and of Masonic systems, all based on the hypothesis that Freemasonry was invented during the Crusades, and the great dogma of which, boldly pronounced by the Baron von Hund in his Rite of Strict Observance, was that every Freemason was a Templar. It will be seen that Ramsay repudiates all the legends which ascribe Masonry to the patriarchs or to the ancient mysteries, and that he rejects all connection with an operative association, looking to chivalry alone for the legitimate source of the fraternity. Adopting the method of writing Masonic history, which had been previously pursued by Anderson, and which was unfortunately followed by other writers of the 18th century, and which has not been altogether abandoned at the present day, Ramsay makes his statements with boldness, draws without stint upon his imagination, presents assumptions in the place of facts, and cites no authority for anything that he advances. As Mossdorf says, since he cites no authority, we are not bound to believe him on his simple word. Ramsay's influence, however, as a man of ability, had its weight, and the theory of the origin of Freemasonry among the Crusaders continued to be taught in some one form or another by subsequent writers, and it was infused by the system makers into most of the rites that were afterward established. Indeed, it may be said that of all the rites now existing, the English and American are the only ones in which some feature of this Templar theory may not be found. The theory of Hutchinson varied somewhat from that of Ramsay, inasmuch as while recognizing the influence of the Crusades upon Masonry, he is inclined to suppose that it was carried there by the Crusaders rather than that it was brought thence by them to Europe.